Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadows of ancient Babylon, a city that once gleamed with unimaginable wealth and power. But like many great civilizations, it had its hidden truths, stories of the women who worked the streets of this ancient wonder, often forgotten, yet undeniably essential to the empire's very fabric. Imagine a bustling marketplace, incense in the air, merchants hawking goods, and at the edges of it all, the women whose roles were wrapped in layers of mystery and controversy. You probably won't survive this journey, not in the sense of dying, but you might find yourself questioning how we view history, or how much we've been told is true. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always find it interesting to see who's tuning in, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Babylon, it wasn't just a city of walls, hanging gardens, and famous kings. It was a city where luxury and exploitation, divinity and degradation, often danced hand in hand. At the very heart of Babylon's wealth and power were the women who found themselves in the shadows, a group so crucial to the functioning of society that their very existence defies simplistic labels. In the grand scheme of things, what were they really? Victims of circumstance or savvy participants in a system that saw them as both tools of pleasure and political pawns? Before you think of these women in a narrow light, let's take a deeper look at the truth. While the grandeur of Babylon's temples and its king's epic conquests might take up most of the history books, the real and gritty story of those who lived in the margins often gets ignored. And that's where the story of Babylon's prostitutes begins. Historians still debate the role of these women in Babylonian society. Some claim they were victims trapped in a cycle of exploitation. Others argue they were women with a surprising amount of agency, working within the confines of a system that allowed them to secure financial stability, and even some respect. What we do know for sure, though, is that prostitution in Babylon wasn't just about sex. It was part of a broader social, religious, and economic structure. In fact, it was so ingrained in Babylonian culture that it often went unnoticed as a key element of the empire's daily workings. While Babylon's prostitutes may have been living in the shadows, they were far from powerless. In fact, many of these women had roles that intertwined with the city's religious practices. Sacred prostitution, widely practiced in the temples of Ishtar, allowed women to take part in rituals that linked their bodies with the divine. Now, don't let the word sacred fool you. It wasn't necessarily as glamorous or empowering as some might think. But it was certainly unique. This was no mere transaction of sex for money. No, in Babylon, women engaged in acts that were part of a larger divine exchange, whether they liked it or not. Imagine, for a moment, what it might have been like to be a temple prostitute in Babylon. It wasn't about personal desire or free will in the modern sense. Instead, it was about aligning with a greater cosmic order, a way of serving the gods. There's a strange duality in this. On one hand, you were performing a duty for the greater good, but on the other, you were also subject to the whims and desires of those who held the power in the society, the priests, the kings, and the elites. Was it a form of spiritual empowerment, or just another layer of social control? Historians still argue whether the sacred prostitute's role was empowering or merely a function of subjugation under the guise of divine service. Some believe that it provided women with access to resources and respect. Others think it was just another form of exploitation in a world where women had very few options for independence. This is where things get murky. The contrast between sacred and secular prostitution in Babylon is stark. While the temple prostitutes were revered for their connection to the divine, those who worked on the streets faced a very different reality. These women often struggled with the stigma of their profession, even as they contributed to the economy of the city. Some were able to negotiate their terms and earn a decent living, but others found themselves bound to a life of destitution, working for the whims of wealthy men who held the real power. Babylon was a city that prided itself on its wealth and sophistication, but beneath that veneer of splendor, its prostitutes represented the underbelly of a society where the divide between the elite and the poor was vast. Yet they were as much a part of Babylon's daily life as the merchants and the kings. As we continue, we'll delve deeper into the lives of these women, their daily routines, the role they played in Babylon's social fabric, and the strange paradox of their lives. Stay tuned as we unravel the secrets of Babylon's shadowy underworld. The role of prostitutes in ancient Babylon wasn't confined to the shadows or the back alleys of the city. They were far more integrated into Babylonian society than you might imagine. In fact, many of these women held an undeniable influence on the daily operations of the empire, whether they were working in the temples, managing their own businesses, or participating in the bustling trade that kept Babylon thriving. They were more than just sex workers. They were deeply embedded in the fabric of Babylon's economy, culture, and even its politics. We tend to think of prostitution as a social stigma in ancient cultures, and Babylon is no exception. But surprisingly, prostitution wasn't just a subversive element in Babylon. It was often institutionalized, supported by the state, and even encouraged by the religious system. While temple prostitution might come to mind when we think of Babylonian women, the everyday reality for many of these women wasn't confined to religious rites. They were entrepreneurs in their own right, navigating a system that saw them as both commodities and powerful players in the economic machine. Babylon's prostitutes were often not as powerless as we'd like to believe. In fact, many of them controlled their own lives and their own earnings. While some were born into poverty or forced into sex work, many had more autonomy than the average citizen of the time. The wealthier ones, in particular, used their status to their advantage, buying property, running businesses, and living independently. Think about it. These women didn't just work in the shadows. They built their own empires in a world that gave them few options. And let's face it, being a businesswoman in ancient Babylon was no easy feat. Historians still debate the true nature of Babylonian society, especially when it comes to prostitution. Was it a system of oppression, where women had little choice but to turn to sex work to survive? Or was it a pragmatic response to a patriarchal society, where women used the system to their advantage, carving out space for themselves in a world that otherwise sidelined them? Some scholars argue that the level of independence some of these women achieved suggests a more complex relationship with the system than simple victimhood. Others contend that regardless of the autonomy some women may have had, the system itself was inherently exploitative. Take, for example, the role of a courtesan. These women were far more than the typical street prostitute. They were educated, cultured, and sometimes even influential. They had the ear of powerful men, including kings and nobles. Their relationships weren't just about sex. They were about securing status, power, and wealth. Some of these women were treated with respect and could demand high fees for their time, much like the elite women of Babylonian society. While this sounds like a privileged position, it's important to remember that the courtesans, like all Babylonian prostitutes, were still subject to the whims of the powerful men they associated with. This intersection of sex, power, and money is a theme that resonates throughout Babylonian history. While the elite might have viewed these women as nothing more than tools for pleasure, many of the women saw themselves as savvy players in a complex game. They knew how to negotiate their worth and find ways to secure resources for themselves. It's a fine line between being a pawn and being a queen in a game you didn't design. And these women, more than most, understood that line all too well. Historians often point to the Code of Hammurabi as a reflection of Babylon's social structure. This ancient law code, one of the earliest and most influential in human history, contains a number of provisions related to prostitution, including the regulation of brothels and the treatment of sex workers. According to Hammurabi's code, prostitutes were to be treated with respect, and their earnings were legally protected. The state took an active role in regulating prostitution, ensuring that both the women and their clients followed the rules. In theory, this provided a measure of legal protection and social stability for these women. In practice, though, it didn't always prevent the exploitation that was rampant in Babylonian society. But despite the relatively regulated system, not all prostitutes in Babylon were treated equally. Those who worked in the temples were often seen as more respectable, serving a divine purpose, while those who worked on the streets or in the brothels were viewed with more contempt. The stigma surrounding street prostitutes was harsh, even though they, too, contributed to the economic fabric of Babylon. These women often lived in squalor, had little access to legal recourse, and were at the mercy of the men who paid for their services. The stark contrast between these two groups of women highlights the paradox at the heart of Babylonian prostitution. On the one hand, it was an accepted and even glorified part of society, but on the other, it was deeply stigmatized and used to reinforce social hierarchies. Despite the complex layers of Babylonian prostitution, it's clear that these women were not just passive victims. They were active participants in a system that both constrained and empowered them. Some managed to rise above the poverty and stigma, while others were caught in a cycle of exploitation. The truth lies somewhere in between the victim and the empowered businesswoman, between the sacred and the profane. And as we continue our journey, we'll see how these women's stories were tied to the very survival of Babylon itself, their power often invisible, yet undeniably significant. As we move deeper into the heart of Babylon's story, it's important to understand the role that religion played in shaping the lives of its prostitutes, specifically, those involved in sacred prostitution. Babylon's temples were centers of both worship and commerce, and at the forefront of this unusual combination were the women who served the gods in more ways than one. Sacred prostitution wasn't just about offering physical pleasure to men, it was about performing a sacred duty that tied the earthly realm to the divine. At least that's what the priests would have you believe. You might picture a woman in elaborate temple garb, standing before the altars of the goddess Ishtar, waiting to serve the spiritual needs of the community. The reality, however, was far more complicated than a simple, holy affair. Sacred prostitution in Babylon had religious, political, and economic overtones that made it far more than just an act of devotion. It was deeply entwined with the very fabric of Babylonian society, acting as both a symbol of divine favor and a means of securing wealth and power for the elites. Historians still debate whether sacred prostitution in Babylon was a true form of religious service or merely a way to maintain social and political control. Some argue that the women involved were, in essence, pawns in a system that used religion as a tool for exploitation. Others contend that these women had more agency than we typically give them credit for, seeing their roles as a form of sacred power in a society that revered female fertility. Whether sacred or not, however, these women found themselves caught between divine duty and social subjugation. Imagine, for a moment, the complex emotions of a woman standing in the temple of Ishtar, dressed in ritualistic garb, performing her sacred duty. The act wasn't merely transactional, it was a ritual that linked the human and divine worlds. In some ways, this could have given these women a sense of power, but there's no denying the reality of their situation. They were still subject to the authority of male priests and kings who dictated the terms of their service. Were these women truly serving the gods, or were they just fulfilling the whims of the powerful men who controlled the temples? This blurring of boundaries, where religious service, sex, and power intersected, left many questioning the nature of Babylon's sacred prostitution. While some believe these women were revered figures who held a unique spiritual position in society, others argue that their role was more about control and exploitation than empowerment. It's difficult to say for certain, as the historical records are sparse and often contradictory. But one thing is clear: sacred prostitution wasn't just a matter of sex, it was part of a broader political and social structure that reinforced the power dynamics of the time. In the context of Babylonian religion, the goddess Ishtar was worshipped as a deity of love, fertility, and war. She was the embodiment of both creation and destruction, a duality that mirrored the roles of her temple prostitutes. On one hand, they were seen as holy women, capable of bridging the gap between the human and divine realms. On the other hand, they were also considered instruments of the state, used to cement alliances, secure resources, and reinforce the social hierarchy. This dual role, divine and subjugated, was a defining characteristic of sacred prostitution in Babylon. The women who participated in these rituals were often from the lower classes, and while they may have been seen as divinely chosen, they were still treated as property. The reality of sacred prostitution in Babylon was a complicated mix of reverence, exploitation, and survival. These women were at the mercy of the same system that held power over the entire society, where the gods, kings, and priests were the ultimate authorities. But the question remains, how much power did these women actually have? Were they complicit in a system that used religion to control and subjugate them, or were they, in their own way, asserting control over their lives and bodies? Some argue that the very act of participating in these rituals gave these women a degree of influence over the social and religious order, even if that influence was limited by the structures of power around them. Others believe that the women involved in sacred prostitution were, ultimately, victims of a system that treated them as nothing more than vessels for divine will, with little regard for their own autonomy. One thing that's often overlooked in discussions of sacred prostitution is the sheer number of women involved. It wasn't just a handful of women in the temples. Sacred prostitution was a widespread practice across the Babylonian Empire. Temples dedicated to Ishtar were scattered throughout the region, and each of them had its own set of temple prostitutes who served the gods and the men who came to worship them. The scale of the practice makes it clear that this wasn't just a fringe element of Babylonian society. It was an integral part of its religious and cultural life. As we continue exploring the lives of these women, it's important to remember that sacred prostitution wasn't the only form of sex work in Babylon. In fact, most women who engaged in prostitution did so outside of the temples, often in the streets or in private brothels. While they may have lacked the religious significance of their temple counterparts, these women were no less important to the economic structure of Babylon. Their roles were just as complex, and just as entwined with the social and political systems that governed the empire. Whether in the temples or on the streets, Babylonian prostitutes were part of a broader system that sought to control, manipulate, and ultimately use them for the benefit of the powerful. But within that system, these women carved out their own space, one that was both constrained by the forces around them and, in some ways, defined by the very act of resistance they embodied. The paradox of sacred prostitution in Babylon is that, while it may have been an act of submission, it was also an act of power in a world that rarely afforded women the chance to wield any. Now, let's take a moment to step into the everyday life of a Babylonian prostitute. While the sacred prostitutes worked within the temple's sacred walls, many of the women who sold their bodies in Babylon operated in the streets or brothels, far removed from divine intervention. These women, often working independently or as part of a brothel, faced a different set of challenges, and a very different kind of existence. Unlike their temple counterparts, they weren't part of any sacred ritual, nor were they viewed with reverence. Instead, their lives were marked by economic hardship, social stigma, and, at times, brutal exploitation. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Babylon, the vibrant marketplace alive with color and noise. Between the stalls of merchants selling everything from fine silk to exotic spices, you would find the women of the night, standing at the edges of society, working at the fringes of the empire. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't about divine favor. It was about survival. These women were selling more than just sex. They were offering a temporary escape from the struggles of their lives, whether it was poverty, hunger, or the harsh social conditions that limited their options. Historians argue about how these women saw themselves. Were they truly victims, trapped in a system that had little regard for their well-being? Or were they pragmatic businesswomen, carving out a living in a society that didn't offer them much else? There's no easy answer. Some scholars believe that many of these women were pushed into prostitution due to economic necessity, while others argue that they were independent agents, choosing this path as a way to gain financial autonomy in a society that otherwise marginalized them. What's clear is that the life of a street prostitute in Babylon was tough, but not without its rewards. Some women earned enough to live independently, managing their own finances and, in some cases, even acquiring property. This was a level of autonomy few other women in Babylonian society would have had. Even more interesting, many of these women were savvy businesswomen, not just selling their bodies, but engaging in the very capitalist system that defined Babylon's economy. Some ran brothels, profiting not just from their own work, but from the labor of other women. They became small-time entrepreneurs, finding ways to navigate a male-dominated world. For many of these women, their daily routines were dictated by the needs of the men who sought their services. Like any other business, timing was everything. There was a rhythm to the work: meet clients, negotiate prices, and provide the service that was expected. Some might work in one of Babylon's many brothels, while others might ply their trade on the streets, where they were more vulnerable to the whims of the men who frequented the area. But regardless of their work environment, these women were keenly aware of their position in the social hierarchy and knew how to use their bodies as currency in a society that saw them as disposable. However, while prostitution may have provided a certain degree of independence, it also came with its dangers. The stigma surrounding prostitutes in Babylon was significant, and these women often faced the risk of abuse, violence, and disease. In a society where women were generally regarded as property, prostitutes were especially vulnerable. The fact that prostitution was legally regulated, as set out by Hammurabi's code, did not eliminate the darker realities of the profession. It simply codified it, creating a legal framework that gave some semblance of order to an inherently chaotic and dangerous trade. The Code of Hammurabi itself included laws that directly addressed prostitution. It stipulated certain rights for the women involved, such as protecting their earnings from the hands of others, especially men. If a prostitute's earnings were stolen, the thief would be punished, though the punishment was far less severe for the thieves than for those involved in other kinds of theft. This legal recognition did provide a level of protection, but it also reinforced the notion that prostitutes were considered part of the lower rungs of Babylonian society, important yet still subordinate to the higher classes. Yet, this regulation also meant that prostitution was somewhat normalized within Babylon. Prostitutes were a recognized part of the social order, and their services were often essential to the functioning of the economy, as much as they were a way of satisfying the desires of powerful men. The women who worked in this trade were not only providing sexual services, they were part of a larger machine that kept the city running. This doesn't mean that they were treated as equals, but it does suggest that their roles were far more integrated into Babylonian society than we might expect. But what about those women who managed to escape the worst aspects of prostitution? There were certainly cases of women who used their position to climb the social ladder, using their charm, business savvy, and resourcefulness to build wealth and status. These women may not have been as famous or revered as the sacred prostitutes in the temples, but they wielded a different kind of power, a power derived from their ability to survive and succeed within a system designed to exploit them. They became a silent force in Babylon's economy, in some ways more influential than the kings who ruled over them. As we move forward, we'll see how these women's stories, often overlooked in history, were a reflection of the greater power structures of Babylon. Their lives were far from simple. They were a complex mix of survival, exploitation, and, at times, surprising independence. And just as these women existed in the shadows of Babylon's streets, so too did the forces of wealth and power that shaped their fates. As we delve deeper into the lives of Babylon's prostitutes, it's impossible to overlook the impact of the Babylonian legal system, particularly the Code of Hammurabi, which regulated all aspects of society, including prostitution. The Code, one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal systems in history, provided a structure within which these women were able to work, but it also reinforced their position as marginalized members of society. Under the Code, prostitution was a legally sanctioned occupation, but it came with its own set of rules and limitations. These rules may have given some semblance of order, but they also made clear the social status of the women involved. Under Hammurabi's Code, the regulation of prostitution was a way for the state to both protect its interests and exert control over a population it deemed necessary for economic and social stability. Prostitutes were subject to a set of specific laws, many of which were intended to prevent abuse and theft of their earnings. However, these women were still ultimately treated as property, first and foremost, subjects of the male-dominated legal system, rather than autonomous individuals with the right to control their own bodies. The regulations offered some protection, but not equality. While the Code gave prostitutes certain protections, it also underscored their status as second-class citizens. One of the most telling aspects of these laws is that they focused more on the protection of male clients than on the welfare of the women themselves. For example, the Code made it clear that if a man stole a prostitute's earnings, the punishment would be relatively light compared to stealing from a free citizen. The reality was that prostitution was seen less as a legitimate profession and more as a service that was necessary for the stability of the city. It's a strange duality. The state recognized the importance of prostitution, but it didn't truly value the women involved in it. The financial aspect of prostitution in Babylon is an intriguing one. Many of these women worked independently, or with others in a brothel, but it was not uncommon for them to accumulate a fair amount of wealth. They were paid in silver, goods, and even land, and some women used their earnings to buy property, run their own businesses, or even purchase slaves. This level of autonomy was rare in a world where most women had very little control over their own financial futures. In a way, Babylonian prostitutes were playing a dangerous game, capitalizing on their status as sex workers to gain a foothold in a world that offered them few opportunities. But let's not romanticize their position too much. While some women may have been able to build a life for themselves, many others were trapped in poverty, forced to rely on men to survive. The system that supported prostitution was a deeply patriarchal one, where men were the ones who controlled wealth and power. Even if a prostitute had some autonomy over her work, she was still at the mercy of the powerful men who dictated the terms of her life. Prostitution in Babylon was not just about money. It was about power, control, and survival. The women who worked as prostitutes were often caught in a web of social and political dynamics that were far beyond their control. In a society where women had little say in their own fate, prostitution became one of the few avenues through which a woman could earn a living and gain some degree of independence. But this independence was always conditional, dependent on the whims of those who held the real power. Many of these women were also heavily involved in the social and cultural life of Babylon. Some worked in the temples, others in the marketplaces, and still others in the private homes of the wealthy. These women were visible parts of Babylonian society, but they were always seen through the lens of their profession. They were sex workers, and that identity, no matter how much they might have achieved outside of it, was always a part of who they were. Even the wealthier women, those who had managed to secure some measure of financial independence, were still stigmatized because of their profession. The stigma of being a prostitute in Babylon was something that could never truly be erased, no matter how much money or power a woman accumulated. The broader societal view of prostitution was complex, and often contradictory. On the one hand, prostitutes were seen as necessary to the social and economic order. On the other hand, they were looked down upon as inferior, even though their work was essential to maintaining the wealth and power of Babylon. This paradox was especially evident in the way these women were treated by the ruling class. While they were given certain rights under the code, they were still subject to the authority of men who used their bodies for their own purposes. Interestingly, this complex relationship between sex, power, and money in Babylon wasn't limited to the lower classes. In fact, the very structure of Babylonian society was built on the exploitation of women in various forms. While women who worked as prostitutes were often considered expendable, other women who were able to secure a place in the elite circles of Babylonian society were afforded certain privileges and protections. Yet, even these women were not truly free from the patriarchal systems that governed their lives. In a society where women were defined by their relationships to men, whether as wives, daughters, or sex workers, their autonomy was always limited. As we move forward, we'll continue to peel back the layers of Babylonian society, examining how prostitution played a role not just in the lives of these women, but in the broader political, economic, and religious systems that defined Babylon. These women, though often marginalized, were in many ways at the center of Babylonian life. Their stories are not just the stories of the exploited. They are the stories of survival, resistance, and power in a world that was far from kind. The role of prostitutes in Babylon wasn't limited to the economic and social spheres. It was also deeply embedded in the politics of the empire. These women, particularly those involved in sacred prostitution, were often used as pawns in the game of power that unfolded behind the grand city walls. Whether serving in temples or brothels, the women who sold their bodies were not simply commodities to be bought and sold. They were, in many ways, part of a larger political structure that used sex and sexuality as a tool of control and influence. Babylonian kings and royal families were not immune to the influence of prostitution. In fact, prostitution often played a role in securing political alliances, making it just as much about power as it was about sex. The connection between prostitution and political power isn't often discussed in mainstream history, but it was a significant factor in the empire's internal politics. Kings and priests, who held the reins of power, could control the sexual economy of Babylon in ways that extended well beyond the temple walls. Women, though often exploited, could also find themselves part of a complex network of power dynamics that shaped the fate of the empire. Historians still debate the extent to which these women were involved in political machinations. Were they simply pawns, used by the elite for their own ends, or did they have some measure of influence over the political decisions of the time? It's difficult to say for certain, but the fact remains that prostitution was a tool of power that the ruling elite used in various ways. Kings and priests could use sacred prostitutes to gain favor with the gods, and in some cases, these women might even have been used to solidify royal power by producing heirs or sealing political deals. In a society where lineage and divine favor were paramount, these women were, to some degree, participants in the political and dynastic games of Babylon. Let's take a look at the practice of sacred prostitution again. The temple prostitutes, who were believed to serve the goddess Ishtar, were not just part of a religious ceremony. They were also involved in securing the social and political order. These women were integral to the religious rituals that held Babylonian society together, and as such, they had a certain influence over the lives of those in power. It's unclear whether they wielded any significant direct influence over political affairs, but their very existence was a reminder of the power of religion in shaping the course of the empire. Despite their power in the religious sphere, the women who served as temple prostitutes were still dependent on the men who controlled the temples. They were at the mercy of the priests, the kings, and the powerful men who made the decisions that affected their lives. This is a paradox of Babylonian prostitution. While these women may have held a certain degree of power in the religious realm, they were still ultimately under the control of the patriarchal system that governed the empire. Their power was limited, and their lives were shaped by the very forces they were supposed to serve. At the same time, Babylonian society was structured in a way that allowed these women a degree of independence, especially when it came to financial matters. Prostitutes who worked independently or in brothels were often able to manage their own money, own property, and even conduct business. This financial autonomy was a rare privilege for women in ancient societies, where most were dependent on male relatives for their livelihood. Yet, even this autonomy was limited by the patriarchal systems in place. Women might have been able to earn and control their own money, but they still had to navigate a system that saw them as inferior to men. Their independence was often precarious, tied to their ability to survive in a world where sex was both a commodity and a weapon. One fascinating aspect of Babylonian prostitution is how it intersected with the concept of public versus private life. While the sacred prostitutes were part of public religious ceremonies and were viewed as semi-divine figures, the street prostitutes who worked in the shadows had far less status. Their lives were marked by secrecy, and they were often relegated to the lower rungs of society, unable to escape the stigma attached to their profession. Despite this, many of these women were able to carve out spaces for themselves in a world that viewed them with contempt. They managed their earnings, built relationships with powerful men, and sometimes even gained wealth and property. But their status was always precarious. A single scandal, a misstep, or a loss of favor with the men who controlled their lives could lead to their downfall. Interestingly, the political influence of Babylonian prostitutes wasn't always tied to their relationships with kings or priests. Many of these women also had relationships with the wealthy merchants and landowners who controlled the city's economy. These relationships were often transactional, sex for money, goods, or protection, but they also gave prostitutes a degree of leverage. While they were always at the mercy of the men they interacted with, they were also able to use their sexuality and charm to secure resources and protection. Despite the complexities of their lives, Babylonian prostitutes were, in many ways, part of a larger political and economic system that transcended their individual status. They were, in a sense, part of the machinery of the empire, helping to maintain the social and political order by providing a service that was both desired and necessary. Whether they were serving the gods, their clients, or their own ambitions, these women were integral to the functioning of Babylonian society. Their lives were marked by survival, power, and struggle, struggling against the forces that sought to control them, and sometimes finding ways to wield their own power in a world that sought to suppress them. The paradox of Babylonian prostitution is that, while these women were often oppressed, they were also essential to the functioning of the empire. In a world where power was concentrated in the hands of the few, these women were both at the mercy of the powerful and able to exert their own influence. As we continue to explore their stories, we'll see how these women navigated a complex and dangerous world, finding ways to survive and sometimes even thrive within a system that sought to exploit them. Word count 1107. Awadi. In the complex web of Babylonian society, prostitution was not just a form of economic survival, it was an integral part of the empire's larger social, political, and religious fabric. But as we have seen, the lives of these women weren't as straightforward as simply selling their bodies for survival. The intricacies of power, control, and survival were woven throughout their experiences, often creating a paradoxical situation where the very system that oppressed them also gave them a certain kind of agency. One of the most significant aspects of Babylonian prostitution was the way it intersected with the city's military and political structure. It's easy to think of the ancient world as a place where politics and religion were often separate, but in Babylon, these two spheres were intertwined, sometimes in ways that used the bodies of women to further the empire's ambitions. Prostitutes, both sacred and secular, were sometimes used to broker alliances, secure political favor, or even solidify dynastic power. Whether through divine favor or sexual liaisons, these women were part of the grand political scheme of the Babylonian Empire. Let's look at the political implications of prostitution in Babylon, particularly the way women were tied to the rise and fall of kings. For Babylon's kings, securing political alliances wasn't just about military victories or diplomatic marriages. It often involved leveraging the power of sex. Kings and rulers would offer the services of their temple prostitutes to foreign dignitaries or rival rulers as a form of tribute, a tool of negotiation, or even a way of sealing peace treaties. These women became part of the broader political machinery that ensured the stability of the empire, their roles serving to reinforce the hierarchy and power dynamics of the time. Historians still argue about whether this form of sexual diplomacy was a sign of Babylon's sophisticated political strategy, or just another form of exploitation. Some see it as an early example of political savvy, where sex was used as a bargaining chip. Others argue that it was a clear demonstration of the patriarchy at work, where women's bodies were treated as commodities to be traded, bartered, and exploited in the name of statecraft. Either way, these women were undeniably part of the empire's political fabric, playing a role that was both pivotal and dehumanizing. For many of these women, their relationships with powerful men, whether kings, priests, or nobles, were their only means of survival. While some may have had the opportunity to build some degree of autonomy, their lives were still subject to the whims of those who controlled the economic and political systems. For example, a prostitute who had the favor of a powerful merchant or king might be able to negotiate better conditions for herself, perhaps even securing a stable income or living situation. But for most, the game was more about survival. In a world where women were so often controlled by the men in power, sex work was one of the few ways a woman could exert any kind of control over her own life. Yet, this control was always precarious, as it was always at the mercy of those who could pull the strings. But the power that these women wielded, whether consciously or not, was limited by the very structure that created their roles in the first place. The hierarchical nature of Babylonian society was such that prostitutes, even those with relative power, were always subject to the larger system. It was a system that valued women's bodies not for their inherent worth, but as tools of exchange, wealth, and social status. The ultimate paradox here is that while prostitution in Babylon could give a woman a measure of financial and social leverage, it could never truly give her freedom. These women were tied to a system that commodified their bodies and, in doing so, stripped them of the most basic of human freedoms, autonomy. Another striking feature of Babylonian prostitution was how it mirrored the city's broader economic structure. Much like the merchants who traded in goods, these women were seen as part of the economic machinery that drove the city. Prostitution was, in many ways, a transaction, an exchange of money, goods, or protection in exchange for services. The commodification of sex was not seen as inherently immoral or shameful. It was simply a part of the economic system. Babylonian society, in its desire to grow and expand, created systems that allowed for the free exchange of goods and services, including sex. But in doing so, it also created a society that relied on the exploitation of the most vulnerable, the women who were forced to sell their bodies to survive. This transactional nature of Babylonian prostitution is perhaps best seen in the broader scope of how these women were viewed by the public. While they may have been able to build wealth or establish a degree of autonomy, their societal worth was ultimately tied to their ability to provide a service. For Babylon's rulers and elites, prostitutes were viewed not as individuals, but as tools that could be used to further their own agendas, whether for pleasure, political gain, or economic profit. Even in the case of sacred prostitutes, whose roles were justified by religious rituals, their value was still linked to their service to the gods and their ability to appease the divine. Despite these power dynamics, the lives of Babylonian prostitutes were not entirely bleak. Many women managed to carve out lives for themselves within the constraints of the system. They may have been controlled by the men who ruled the empire, but they were not completely powerless. They negotiated their own terms, found ways to build relationships with powerful men, and sometimes even amassed wealth and property. In a world that offered them few choices, prostitution became a way of life, a means of survival that allowed women to navigate an otherwise oppressive system. At the same time, the precariousness of this position cannot be overstated. Despite any material wealth or influence these women may have gained, their ultimate survival was dependent on a system that sought to exploit them. The precarious balance between survival and exploitation, between agency and subjugation, was a central theme in their lives. Babylon's prostitutes, both sacred and secular, were caught in a complex web of power, survival, and exploitation, each woman trying to carve out some space for herself within a world that often sought to silence her. As we continue to unravel the history of these women, it's important to remember that their lives were not just a story of exploitation. They were survivors, navigating a brutal world in ways that men often overlooked or dismissed. Despite the limitations placed on them, these women played a pivotal role in shaping the Babylonian Empire, and their stories remain a testament to their resilience. The role of prostitution in Babylon was not confined merely to economics or politics. It also found a significant place in the spiritual and religious practices of the empire. We've already touched on the sacred prostitution associated with the temples of Ishtar, but to truly understand the breadth of this practice, we need to dive deeper into how the religious establishment used sex work to fulfill both sacred and state purposes. Sacred prostitution, while often sensationalized in modern discussions, was not merely about sexual acts. It was intricately linked to the divine mandate that governed Babylon. In the temples, sex was seen as a form of worship, a way of aligning human actions with the will of the gods. The worship of Ishtar, goddess of love and fertility, was at the heart of Babylonian religious practice. According to the belief system, the sexual union performed in the temple wasn't just an earthly act. It was believed to stimulate the gods, encouraging fertility and prosperity for the entire city. The priestesses who served in this capacity were not merely prostitutes in the conventional sense. They were seen as holy women whose sexual acts were believed to serve a divine purpose. Historians still debate the true nature of sacred prostitution in Babylon. Some claim that it was a genuine form of worship that empowered the women who participated in it, granting them a special connection to the gods. Others, however, argue that the women were essentially exploited by the priesthood, used as instruments in a religious system that masked their subjugation under the guise of sacred duty. What is clear, however, is that these women played a vital role in Babylonian religious life and were, at least to some degree, seen as divine intermediaries, offering their bodies as part of rituals intended to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the empire. But sacred prostitution was just one layer of Babylonian sex work. For those who worked outside of the temples, their involvement in sex work wasn't tied to the gods or religious rituals. It was simply a means of survival in a city where wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a few. These women were less likely to be revered for their role and more likely to be seen as outcasts, whose bodies were commodified for the enjoyment and satisfaction of the men who could afford their services. Yet, even outside the religious sphere, sex work in Babylon was treated with a certain level of institutionalized recognition. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, offered these women some legal protection, ensuring that their earnings were safeguarded and that they were not to be subject to arbitrary violence. Despite these protections, the lives of secular prostitutes were far from easy. They were still viewed as lower-class citizens, often living in squalor and constantly at the mercy of the men they served. Yet, some women managed to carve out a semblance of autonomy. Some brothel owners were able to build wealth and even secure political influence, using their position to negotiate for better terms and access to resources. These women, while still trapped in the system of exploitation, wielded a form of power that was rare for women in the ancient world. The paradox of Babylonian prostitution was that while these women were often oppressed, they were also able to build small empires, managing wealth and running businesses that allowed them to thrive within the constraints of their roles. However, the system was far from perfect. Many of these women, especially those who worked in brothels or on the streets, faced constant dangers. They were vulnerable to exploitation, disease, and violence. While the Code of Hammurabi granted them some legal protections, it didn't provide a way to escape the stigma of their profession. These women were still subject to the same social and political structures that relegated them to the margins of society. The tension between the economic power some of these women held and the social powerlessness they faced is a defining characteristic of Babylonian prostitution. One of the most intriguing aspects of Babylonian prostitution is the role that sex work played in the broader social fabric of the empire. Despite the stigma surrounding the profession, sex work was a necessary part of Babylonian life. It was not seen as a deviant or morally reprehensible act, but as a part of the natural order, crucial to maintaining the city's wealth and prosperity. Prostitutes were regarded as essential to the functioning of Babylonian society, providing a service that was both necessary and valuable. Yet, their roles were largely invisible, and their contributions were often overlooked by historians who focused on the grandeur of Babylon's kings and temples. These women, despite their significance, remained largely anonymous in the historical narrative. In addition to the religious and economic aspects of prostitution, there was also a social element to Babylonian sex work that we cannot ignore. For some women, prostitution was a form of rebellion, a way to assert control over their own lives in a world that gave them few choices. It's easy to imagine that for some women, sex work may have been a way to escape an even worse fate, such as slavery or abject poverty. In a world where women had few rights and even fewer opportunities for independence, prostitution was sometimes the only option left. At the same time, we must acknowledge the darker side of this practice. Many women were coerced or sold into prostitution, either by poverty, family circumstances, or social pressures. These women were the most vulnerable, trapped in a cycle of exploitation that left them with little chance of escape. The system that allowed these women to survive also kept them bound within a rigid social structure, preventing them from ever truly achieving freedom. In the end, the lives of Babylonian prostitutes are a testament to the complexities of survival in an ancient world. These women were caught between two worlds, one where their bodies were commodified for the pleasure of others, and another where they were seen as essential to the economic, religious, and political systems that kept Babylon running. Despite their marginalized status, they were integral to the city's success. Their stories are ones of resilience, power, and tragedy, and they serve as a reminder of the often unseen women whose lives have been shaped by the forces of history. As we continue to unravel the history of Babylonian prostitution, we must address the societal consequences of such an ingrained system. The practice of prostitution, whether sacred or secular, had far-reaching implications for Babylonian culture, economics, and even its eventual decline. The system was both a necessary pillar of Babylon's prosperity and a mirror of the larger flaws within the empire, flaws that would eventually contribute to its downfall. One of the primary ways prostitution impacted Babylonian society was through its influence on the social structure. As we've seen, prostitution was tightly bound to the patriarchal system that dominated Babylonian life. Women in this system were often seen not as individuals, but as tools, either for divine purposes in the case of sacred prostitution or for the pleasure and economic benefit of men in the case of secular sex work. This hierarchical structure not only reinforced male dominance but also limited women's opportunities for independence and advancement. While some women managed to climb the social ladder through their work as courtesans or brothel owners, most remained trapped within a cycle of exploitation. In this way, prostitution acted as both a reflection and a reinforcement of the rigid class structures in Babylonian society. But it wasn't just the women involved in prostitution who were affected by this system. Men, too, were caught in a complex web of power dynamics, expectations, and moral contradictions. On one hand, Babylon's elites, kings, priests, and nobles, used prostitution to further their own political, social, and economic agendas. On the other, these men were also bound by a system that commodified women and limited their own freedom to express genuine intimacy or emotional connection. Men in Babylonian society were expected to take part in this system, whether through temple rituals, sexual alliances, or the simple purchase of a prostitute's services. Their relationships with women were defined by power and hierarchy, which created a disconnect between personal desire and societal expectations. Historians continue to debate the role of sex work in the eventual decline of Babylonian society. Some suggest that the exploitation of women, coupled with the deep social and moral divisions created by the commodification of sexuality, contributed to the empire's weakening over time. As Babylon's wealth grew and its political and religious systems became more entrenched, the state's focus on consolidating power through rituals, including sacred prostitution, may have become unsustainable. The very practice that had once been seen as a divine necessity, securing the favor of the gods and ensuring the fertility of the land, began to be viewed by some as a sign of moral decay. Prostitution, particularly in its sacred form, may have contributed to a culture of indulgence and excess, undermining the social cohesion necessary for Babylon's survival. Some scholars argue that the decline of Babylon was not solely due to external factors, such as military invasion or economic collapse. Instead, they suggest that the empire's internal corruption, manifested in the exploitation of women, the use of sex as a tool for political gain, and the systematic oppression of the lower classes, was just as significant in leading to its downfall. Prostitution, in this sense, was a symptom of a deeper societal malaise, a society that had grown so reliant on the commodification of sex and power that it could no longer sustain itself. The moral contradictions inherent in the Babylonian system of prostitution had a ripple effect throughout the empire. While sex work was necessary for the economic and religious systems to function, it also served as a stark reminder of the moral compromises that were being made in the name of power, wealth, and divine favor. The sacred prostitution practiced in the temples of Ishtar, for example, was both a form of worship and a form of control over the bodies of women and the spiritual well-being of the empire. This dual nature, both sacred and profane, created a complex moral landscape, where the divine and the human collided in ways that were both empowering and dehumanizing. The legacy of Babylonian prostitution, and the empire itself, can be seen in the way it continues to shape modern perceptions of sex work. While we may no longer have sacred prostitution or temple rituals tied to divine favor, the commodification of sex and the exploitation of women continue to be pressing issues in today's society. The parallels between ancient and modern systems of sex work are striking, especially when we consider how prostitution remains both a necessary part of some economies and a deeply stigmatized, marginalized profession. The women of Babylon were not merely victims of their circumstances. They were survivors, navigating a brutal system that, in many ways, still persists in different forms today. As we reflect on the lives of these women, whether they served in the temples, on the streets, or in the brothels, one thing is clear: Their stories are deeply intertwined with the larger story of Babylon itself. The practice of prostitution in the ancient world wasn't just about sex, it was about power, survival, and the complexities of human relationships. The women involved in these practices were both victims and agents of change, navigating a world that gave them few options but to find their own way through the system. And so, the story of Babylonian prostitution is not just a story of exploitation, it is also one of resistance, survival, and the complex negotiations that women in ancient societies had to make in order to carve out lives for themselves within a world that sought to control them. As we move further into history, we can see how the legacy of these women continues to inform our understanding of sex work and the systems of power that continue to shape the lives of those involved in it. As we continue exploring the legacies of Babylonian prostitution, it's important to recognize that these women's stories didn't just fade away into history. While the Empire of Babylon itself eventually crumbled, the practice of prostitution continued to evolve and take on new forms in subsequent civilizations. The social and economic structures that were in place during the height of Babylon's power didn't vanish with the fall of the empire. They were reworked, repurposed, and carried forward. Babylonian prostitution, particularly sacred prostitution, would go on to leave a lasting mark on the way later societies viewed sex work and women's roles within the economic and religious systems. One key factor in the continued existence of prostitution in subsequent cultures is the way the Babylonian system treated the profession. While prostitutes were often viewed as low-status individuals, their roles in the empire were deeply integrated into the social and economic structure. This normalization of sex work carried over into future civilizations in the ancient world, particularly those in the Mediterranean. Ancient Greece and Rome, for example, had their own forms of temple prostitution, though often with differences in the specific rituals and the degree to which women were involved in political and religious duties. In these later societies, prostitution continued to be seen as a necessary, even essential, part of the social fabric. However, as time passed and the influence of Christianity grew in the West, the moral and social view of prostitution began to shift. Early Christian teachings on chastity, purity, and the sanctity of marriage increasingly marginalized the role of prostitution in society, pushing it to the edges and condemning it as immoral. This shift in religious and cultural attitudes would influence how sex work was perceived in the centuries that followed. But despite these changing views, prostitution remained a constant, with women continuing to engage in the practice, often in secret, due to societal shame and legal repercussions. Historians still debate the long-term impact of ancient systems like Babylon's on the evolution of prostitution in the Western world. Did the way the Babylonians institutionalized prostitution set a precedent for other cultures? Or did the practice evolve in response to different religious, political, and economic pressures? There's no clear answer, but what we do know is that the ideas about sexuality, class, and gender roles that were in play in Babylonian society influenced many subsequent cultures. Despite the broader historical trend of stigmatizing sex work, ancient civilizations like Babylon treated prostitution as part of the natural order, an economic necessity that supported the stability of their societies. In contrast, as time went on, Western societies began to treat it more as a moral failing. This shift in perception didn't remove the realities of sex work. It simply drove it further underground, where it continued to be exploited and ignored in equal measure. But in Babylon, sex work was an open and acknowledged profession, albeit one that came with considerable risks and a deep sense of social and political stratification. While sacred prostitutes were revered, those in the streets and brothels were left to navigate a world that often saw them as little more than disposable commodities. Yet, there was a certain recognition of the economic and social necessity of their work. They were more than just an afterthought. They were a cog in the larger machine of Babylonian life, essential yet invisible. This duality is a theme that continues to recur throughout the history of sex work. The women involved in Babylonian prostitution may have been marginalized, but they were also indispensable. This paradox of being both essential and expendable, both revered and stigmatized, continues to define the way sex work is viewed in modern times. The line between exploitation and empowerment in prostitution has always been blurry, and it remains so today. In a world where the commodification of sex continues, it's hard not to see the echoes of Babylonian practices in the way sex work is still treated in various societies. We also have to consider the way modern-day perceptions of sex work have been shaped by these ancient practices. Even though the systems of Babylon are long gone, the treatment of women as commodities, whether as sacred priestesses or street prostitutes, has influenced the ongoing debates about women's autonomy, sexual rights, and the nature of consent. While we've made strides in some areas, much of what we've learned from ancient societies still shapes the way we understand sex work today. The legacy of Babylonian prostitution isn't just a relic of the past, it's a reflection of enduring questions about power, gender, and society that continue to define modern struggles for equality. The idea of sex as both a sacred and profane act, as seen in Babylon, remains an important part of how we view the intersection of religion, sex, and power in modern-day politics. We see echoes of this in today's debates over issues like reproductive rights, the legalization of sex work, and the regulation of pornography. These are issues that have their roots in ancient systems like Babylon's, where sex work was institutionalized but still relegated to the margins of society. Ultimately, Babylon's history with prostitution is not just a story about the past, it's a lens through which we can view the ongoing challenges that women face in the modern world. The commodification of women's bodies, the use of sex as a tool of political power, and the moral contradictions of prostitution continue to be pressing issues that society has yet to fully address. The women of Babylon, whose stories are so often overlooked, played a role in shaping the future of sex work in ways we are only beginning to understand. Their lives were shaped by the systems they lived in, just as today's sex workers are shaped by the systems we've built. The echoes of Babylonian prostitution, both sacred and secular, remind us that the treatment of women and sex in society is not just a matter of the past, but an ongoing conversation. As we reflect on the lives of these women, we must acknowledge both their suffering and their resilience, and consider the lessons they leave behind for future generations. The history of prostitution in ancient Babylon is not simply one of exploitation or moral decay. It is also a story of resilience, adaptation, and survival. As we've seen, Babylonian society provided certain protections and privileges to sex workers, especially those involved in sacred prostitution, yet it simultaneously subjected them to the control and whims of a patriarchal system. The women who lived through this system often had to navigate a world of contradictions, where their bodies were both revered and discarded, their labor essential but stigmatized. These contradictions were not limited to Babylon. Throughout history, they would continue to be mirrored in other cultures, reflecting deep-seated tensions between gender, power, and sexuality. Looking at Babylon's use of prostitution through a modern lens, it's tempting to view it as a straightforward system of exploitation. And to some extent, that's true. Women were subjected to the economic and social forces that demanded their labor, often with little control over their lives. But it would be reductive to ignore the ways in which these women fought for autonomy within their constrained circumstances. Some of them, especially the wealthier prostitutes and brothel owners, were able to carve out a degree of independence and security in a world that offered few alternatives for women. Their stories offer us a nuanced perspective on power and survival in a system that was both oppressive and opportunistic. We can't ignore, though, that the darker side of Babylonian prostitution, particularly for the lower-class street prostitutes, was brutal. Many of these women faced constant danger, from physical violence to the risk of disease and exploitation. Their work, while necessary to the city's economy, placed them at the mercy of men who saw them as little more than commodities to be used and discarded. But even in the face of such adversity, these women were, in their own way, exercising agency. Whether they were negotiating their terms or using their bodies as currency for protection, they played a role in shaping the dynamics of their world, even if those roles were often invisible or undervalued. The parallel between the women of Babylon and modern sex workers is undeniable. In both ancient and contemporary societies, the commodification of sex remains a key issue. In Babylon, the state both exploited and protected these women, offering them some legal rights while simultaneously denying them full autonomy. In the modern world, we see similar contradictions. In some countries, sex work is legal and regulated, yet those who engage in it often face societal stigma and legal restrictions. In other places, sex work is criminalized, forcing workers into the shadows where they are more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The lessons from Babylon's prostitution system remind us that while societal structures may change, the ways in which sex and power are intertwined remain strikingly consistent across time. But let's also take a moment to acknowledge the complexity of the women who lived these lives. While the system in which they worked was oppressive, it didn't completely strip them of agency. These women were not passive victims. They were often active participants in a system that gave them few choices but still offered them the possibility of independence, however fragile. They were businesswomen and survivors, navigating a world that was both exploitative and empowering. This duality is one of the key takeaways from the history of prostitution in Babylon, that even in a system designed to marginalize and control them, women still managed to assert their power in small but significant ways. Let's also remember that the system that allowed prostitution to flourish in Babylon, whether sacred or secular, was not simply a reflection of the moral failings of a single society. Rather, it speaks to the ways in which sexual labor has been historically tied to social and economic power. In ancient Babylon, as in many other cultures, the control of women's sexuality was a tool of power, a way for the elite to maintain control over both the spiritual and material realms of life. The sacred prostitution of the temple, while often romanticized as a form of divine service, was also a form of social control, ensuring that women's bodies were used for the benefit of the state and its rulers. The same holds true in modern societies, where sex work, despite being viewed as a form of exploitation by many, remains a crucial part of both the economy and the undercurrents of power dynamics. In this sense, Babylon's prostitution system was both revolutionary and regressive. It recognized the power of sexual labor, integrating it into both the spiritual and economic life of the city. But it also reinforced the idea that women's bodies were to be used as tools, either to serve the gods or to serve the men who controlled them. While some women gained power and wealth within this system, the vast majority of prostitutes were relegated to the margins, their lives shaped by forces far beyond their control. It is essential to approach the history of Babylonian prostitution with both a critical and empathetic eye. We must not romanticize the lives of these women, nor should we oversimplify their experiences. These women were caught between systems of exploitation and survival, forced to navigate a world that offered few options for agency or independence. At the same time, their stories are a testament to the resilience of women throughout history, how, even in the face of immense social and political pressure, they managed to find ways to survive, carve out spaces of autonomy, and, in some cases, challenge the very systems that sought to control them. So, as we consider the legacy of Babylonian prostitution, let's not just focus on the exploitation. Let's also think about the ways in which these women, both sacred and secular, found ways to assert power within the constraints of their world. The history of these women is one of complexity, contradiction, and ultimately, survival. And in understanding their struggles, we also gain a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped not only ancient Babylon but also modern societies, where women's bodies continue to be a site of political and economic struggle. As we continue to piece together the fragmented history of Babylonian prostitution, it's important to consider not just the experiences of the women involved, but also how their lives and roles were memorialized, or not, by the societies that followed. One of the most striking features of the history of Babylon's prostitutes is how their stories have largely been erased or overlooked in mainstream historical narratives. In a world where men's achievements were immortalized in grand monuments, and the king's legacies written in stone, the lives of these women were relegated to the margins. Despite the essential roles they played in the economic, religious, and political structures of Babylon, their voices remained silent in much of history. This erasure is not unique to Babylon, it's a pattern that repeats throughout history. The contributions of women, especially those in marginalized professions like prostitution, have often been ignored or minimized, leaving behind a skewed historical record that prioritizes the actions of men. Yet, the history of Babylonian prostitution challenges us to rethink this narrative. These women, despite their subjugation, were powerful agents in their own right. They were the ones who navigated the complex systems of power, wealth, and survival that kept the city functioning. The fact that their stories have not been preserved tells us as much about the biases of the historians who wrote about Babylon as it does about the realities these women faced. Historians still argue over the reasons behind this historical erasure. Some suggest that the practice of prostitution, particularly in its sacred form, was too controversial for later societies to comprehend or accept. Others believe that the role of women in ancient societies, particularly in the realm of sex work, was seen as too morally ambiguous to be celebrated. The discomfort with acknowledging prostitution as an integral part of ancient economies has led to its omission from many historical accounts. However, in recent years, scholars have begun to revisit these overlooked stories, seeking to reclaim the voices of women who were often written out of history. Revisiting Babylon's history, we can see that prostitution was not merely an afterthought in the empire's structure. It was a key part of its identity. It was both a tool of power and a source of survival, providing women with access to wealth, autonomy, and sometimes even influence. The women who participated in sacred prostitution were integral to the empire's religious and cultural practices, and those who worked in brothels or on the streets were essential to the empire's economic and social functioning. Their roles were not passive, but active, even if their autonomy was limited by the structures around them. But as Babylon fell and its influence waned, the perception of prostitution began to shift. The collapse of the empire led to a shift in how women in sex work were viewed by subsequent cultures. In later empires, including those in Greece and Rome, prostitution was still a prominent part of society, but the attitudes toward it began to harden. Where Babylonian prostitution had been institutionalized and, in some cases, even religiously sanctioned, later cultures began to stigmatize it more aggressively. The rise of monotheistic religions, especially Christianity, led to a more rigid moral framework that painted sex work as sinful and immoral. This shift in perception further pushed the stories of women in prostitution to the edges of history. However, the historical treatment of these women as morally suspect or invisible doesn't change the fact that they were crucial to the very fabric of Babylonian society. We may never know all of the details of their lives, but the surviving fragments of their stories reveal a remarkable truth. These women, in the face of immense oppression and exploitation, found ways to thrive. They navigated systems of power, found ways to assert some control over their lives, and left behind traces of their resilience that continue to be uncovered. For modern readers, the history of Babylonian prostitution offers more than just a window into ancient society. It also serves as a mirror, reflecting the ways in which we continue to marginalize and exploit women today. The historical erasure of these women's stories is not just a matter of academic interest. It speaks to the ongoing struggles of women involved in sex work, who continue to fight for recognition, rights, and protection in a world that often views them as disposable. In this way, the women of Babylon, both sacred and secular prostitutes, continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about gender, power, and sexuality. One thing that becomes clear as we examine the legacy of Babylonian prostitution is that, despite the passage of time, the issues these women faced have not disappeared. The commodification of sex and the marginalization of women in sex work continue to be pressing issues in modern societies. Whether it's through the criminalization of sex work, the stigma attached to those who engage in it, or the ongoing debates about the legalization and regulation of prostitution, the struggles of ancient Babylonian prostitutes are still very much alive today. As we reflect on their stories, we must also think about how we can move forward. The women of Babylon, in their complexity and contradiction, teach us valuable lessons about survival and resistance in a world that often seeks to silence the most vulnerable. Their history is not just one of suffering, it is also one of resilience, agency, and the ongoing fight for recognition and justice. By reclaiming their stories, we can begin to understand not only the past but also the present, and perhaps pave the way for a more inclusive, compassionate future for women everywhere. As we approach the final chapters of our journey through the world of Babylonian prostitution, it's important to reflect on the long-term impact of these practices, not only on the women involved but on the civilizations that followed. The system of sacred and secular prostitution in Babylon was far more than a social anomaly. It was a defining feature of the empire, influencing everything from religious practices to political structures. The women who participated in these systems, often relegated to the margins of history, played essential roles in Babylon's rise and fall, shaping the social and economic life of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. One of the most lasting legacies of Babylonian prostitution is its influence on the way later cultures approached sex work. While Babylon was relatively open about the role of prostitution in its society, later civilizations, especially in the Western world, adopted a much more repressive attitude. Ancient Greece and Rome, for example, followed in Babylon's footsteps by incorporating prostitution into the fabric of their social and religious systems. But with the rise of Christianity and other monotheistic religions, attitudes towards sex work became more stigmatized. In these later cultures, sex work was viewed not just as a moral failing, but as something that was inherently sinful. Babylon's relatively neutral stance on prostitution, with its integration into religious rituals and societal functions, became an exception in the history of sex work, overshadowed by the moralistic views that followed. Yet, despite the moral condemnations of later societies, the essential role of sex work in economies and cultures didn't disappear. It simply went underground, marginalized, and criminalized. Modern societies still struggle with the complexities of prostitution, with ongoing debates about its legality, regulation, and the treatment of those involved. In many ways, these discussions echo the debates of ancient Babylon, where prostitution was both necessary and problematic. Today's societies, much like Babylon, continue to grapple with how to view sex work as a form of exploitation, a necessary evil, or even a legitimate profession deserving of rights and recognition. While Babylon's legal code, particularly the Code of Hammurabi, provided certain protections for sex workers, it also reinforced the rigid social hierarchies that governed the empire. Prostitutes were legally recognized, but their rights were always secondary to those of men. They were treated as tools, either for divine service and sacred prostitution or as commodities for male pleasure and secular work. In many ways, modern sex workers face a similar struggle for recognition and rights, as they continue to be treated as less than human in the eyes of many legal and societal systems. The history of Babylonian prostitution is a reminder of how deeply ingrained the marginalization of sex workers has been throughout human history. This historical parallel brings us to the central issue that Babylonian prostitution raises in our modern context: how we view women's autonomy, especially when it comes to their bodies. In Babylon, women were often treated as property, first by the state, and then by the men who controlled the economy and religion. This shift from viewing women as sacred objects of divine service to seeing them as tools for male pleasure highlights the precarious nature of women's autonomy in societies that regard them as less than equal. Today, many sex workers still struggle to gain control over their bodies in a society that continues to view them through a moral lens of shame and exploitation. This struggle is not just about the right to work, it is about the right to exist on equal footing with others, free from stigma and exploitation. Modern debates about sex work often center around issues of consent, coercion, and exploitation. In Babylon, women who were involved in prostitution were often forced into the profession by economic necessity, social pressure, or, in the case of sacred prostitution, by religious or political demands. Today, many sex workers find themselves in similarly constrained circumstances, with few options for independence or autonomy. While some sex workers are able to build wealth and independence, the majority face systemic barriers, stigma, criminalization, lack of legal protection, that limit their ability to exercise true agency. In this way, the legacy of Babylonian prostitution continues to inform modern struggles for sex workers' rights, highlighting the need for societal change that allows individuals to choose their work without fear of judgment or punishment. As we reflect on the ancient history of Babylonian prostitution, we must also acknowledge the broader social implications of this practice. Babylon was a society built on the exploitation of labor, both male and female. While the system of prostitution may have been one of the more visible forms of exploitation, it was not the only one. From the slaves who worked in the royal palaces to the peasants who tilled the land, the exploitation of the lower classes was deeply entrenched in the empire's economic and social systems. The use of women's bodies for economic, religious, and political gain was just one part of a larger system that sustained the empire's wealth and power. Today, we see similar patterns in societies that rely on marginalized groups for cheap labor, with sex workers often among the most vulnerable. One of the lessons we can learn from Babylonian prostitution is that systems of exploitation often thrive in secrecy, shame, and silence. These women's stories, while largely forgotten in the historical record, speak to the broader struggles of those who live in the margins of society, people whose labor is essential to the functioning of the system but who are rarely given the recognition or rights they deserve. The struggle for sex workers' rights today is part of a much larger fight for social justice, where those who have been oppressed and marginalized for centuries demand recognition, dignity, and the freedom to live and work on their own terms. In reclaiming the stories of Babylonian prostitutes, we not only learn more about the ancient past but also gain valuable insight into the struggles that continue to affect sex workers today. The women of Babylon, in their complexity and resilience, remind us that the fight for autonomy, recognition, and respect is ongoing. Their legacy is not just one of exploitation, it is also one of resistance, survival, and the ongoing struggle for a world where all people, regardless of gender or profession, are valued and respected for who they are. As we near the conclusion of our exploration of Babylonian prostitution, it's important to reflect on how the legacies of ancient practices continue to shape the world today, both in terms of how we view the past and how we confront the challenges of the present. The stories of Babylonian prostitutes, both sacred and secular, are more than just historical curiosities. They are a powerful lens through which we can examine the persistent inequalities and moral contradictions that persist in modern societies. While we may no longer have sacred temple prostitution or the same legal frameworks as ancient Babylon, the core issues surrounding the commodification of women's bodies, the regulation of sex work, and the fight for autonomy remain as relevant as ever. The political, religious, and economic functions of prostitution in Babylon were inseparable from the empire's structures of power. Sex work in Babylon was not just about personal transactions, it was about maintaining the empire's stability, securing its wealth, and reinforcing social hierarchies. Whether it was through the role of sacred prostitutes in divine rituals or the strategic use of sex to solidify political power, prostitution in Babylon was a tool of control, shaping the very fabric of the empire. In a similar way, the regulation and treatment of sex work in modern societies are deeply tied to the structures of power, class, and gender that dominate contemporary life. Today, sex work remains a battleground for human rights, with debates about decriminalization, legalization, and workers' rights reflecting the same tensions that existed in ancient Babylon. In ancient Babylon, while some prostitutes were able to gain financial autonomy and power within the confines of their roles, the vast majority faced systemic exploitation and violence. The laws of Hammurabi, while offering certain protections, did not provide true equality or independence. They merely regulated prostitution as a necessary evil, maintaining the status quo and reinforcing the patriarchal structures of power. Similarly, while some modern societies have enacted laws designed to protect sex workers, these laws often fail to address the underlying issues of criminalization, stigma, and inequality. In fact, many laws that claim to protect sex workers still contribute to their marginalization, pushing them into more dangerous and vulnerable situations. In both ancient and modern contexts, the struggle for the full recognition of sex workers' rights, along with the fight for social justice and gender equality, remains an ongoing challenge. At the same time, Babylon's legacy of prostitution shows us that even within deeply exploitative systems, women have always found ways to survive and assert their agency. Whether by negotiating better terms, running their own businesses, or using their position to gain power, these women navigated the system in ways that were not always visible but were nonetheless powerful. In this sense, the women of Babylon were not passive victims. They were agents of their own survival, finding ways to assert their value in a world that often denied them any real autonomy. This legacy of resistance, resilience, and survival continues to inspire sex workers today, who, despite facing marginalization and systemic violence, continue to fight for their rights and dignity. The resilience of Babylonian prostitutes is not just a historical footnote, it is part of a larger, global struggle for women's autonomy, especially in contexts where their bodies are commodified. The women of Babylon, particularly those in secular prostitution, face daily challenges, often living in poverty and violence, yet they managed to navigate a system that left them with little room for empowerment. The history of these women reminds us that the struggle for sex workers' rights is not just about the work itself, it's about the broader systems of inequality that shape our world. In modern societies, where sex work is still criminalized in many parts of the world, the lessons from Babylon can inform the ongoing debate about how we treat women, labor, and sexuality. As we look at the historical narrative of Babylonian prostitution, we must also acknowledge how far we have come in terms of understanding the rights of those involved in sex work. While there is still much progress to be made, modern activism has created space for important conversations about decriminalization, labor rights, and the social justice aspects of sex work. Today, there is growing recognition that sex work is a labor issue, and that sex workers, like all workers, deserve the same legal protections, rights, and respect. The lessons we learn from ancient Babylon, about exploitation, survival, and resistance, serve as a foundation for these modern conversations, reminding us that the struggle for equality is as much about dignity as it is about legal recognition. Ultimately, the history of Babylonian prostitution is about more than just the women who lived through it. It is a reflection of the social, political, and religious systems that use sex and women's bodies as tools of control, and a reminder that the struggles for autonomy, respect, and equality are as ancient as civilization itself. The women of Babylon, though often erased from history, played an integral role in shaping the empire, and their stories continue to resonate today. They remind us that while systems of exploitation can be deeply entrenched, the human capacity for survival, resistance, and agency is equally enduring. As we draw this story to a close, let us reflect on the legacy of Babylonian prostitution not just as a tale of exploitation, but as a testament to resilience. The women who lived through this system were not mere victims. They were survivors who fought for autonomy and dignity in a world that sought to strip them of both. By reclaiming their stories, we acknowledge the ongoing struggles of sex workers today and work toward a future where all women, regardless of profession, are respected, valued, and treated with dignity. As we conclude this journey through the shadowy and complex world of Babylonian prostitution, it's clear that the lives of these women are not just a chapter in ancient history. They are part of an ongoing conversation about gender, power, and sexuality that continues to resonate today. The paradox of their existence, both revered and exploited, empowered and subjugated, offers valuable insights into the ways that societies have historically dealt with sex, women, and power. And as we move forward, it's worth reflecting on the lessons these women's stories offer for contemporary discussions surrounding sex work, gender inequality, and social justice. The women of Babylon, particularly those involved in sacred prostitution, were caught in a system where their bodies were simultaneously tools of divine service and commodities to be traded for the benefit of the ruling class. These women were not passive figures. They participated in a system that, while exploiting them, also gave them access to power and influence in a world that often relegated women to the background. Sacred prostitution was as much about the political and economic benefits to the state as it was about religious ritual. In this way, Babylon's use of sex work was deeply tied to its religious and political structures, with women serving as vessels for both divine and earthly power. Yet, as we have seen, this power was never truly theirs to own. The reality for most Babylonian prostitutes, whether sacred or secular, was that they were bound by the larger structures of power that controlled their lives. They were subject to the authority of kings, priests, and wealthy merchants, whose decisions dictated the terms of their existence. Despite their occasional independence or ability to gain wealth, they remained in a precarious position, constantly at the mercy of the patriarchal systems that governed Babylon. In this way, their autonomy was always limited, controlled by forces they could not fully escape. This sense of entrapment, however, did not negate the power that these women held within their limited sphere. Whether through negotiating the terms of their work, building relationships with powerful men, or establishing small businesses, many Babylonian prostitutes were able to exercise a degree of agency within the constraints of their roles. In some cases, these women were able to gain financial security, and in rare instances, even social status. But it is essential to remember that these moments of agency were exceptions, not the rule. The majority of women were caught in a system of exploitation that offered little room for true freedom. When we look at the legacy of Babylonian prostitution, we must consider how it shaped the societies that followed. Ancient Babylon may have fallen, but its practices and attitudes towards sex work were carried forward into later empires, including the Greek and Roman worlds. These civilizations continued to view sex work as a necessary part of the economy, though they also stigmatized it. As the centuries passed and Christianity gained influence, attitudes toward prostitution became more repressive, painting sex work as inherently immoral. This shift from an open acknowledgement of prostitution as part of the social fabric to a moral condemnation of it reflects larger societal changes in how sexuality, gender, and power were understood. In modern times, the conversation about sex work has come full circle. In many parts of the world, sex work remains criminalized or stigmatized, and sex workers continue to face violence, exploitation, and discrimination. Yet, there is also a growing movement for the decriminalization of sex work, advocating for the rights and protections of sex workers and seeking to remove the stigma that surrounds the profession. This modern struggle echoes the past, reminding us that the commodification of sex and the exploitation of women's bodies are not new phenomena. They have existed for millennia, but so too have the movements for change, the demands for justice, and the voices of women fighting for their rights. In many ways, the women of Babylon can be seen as the precursors to today's sex workers who continue to navigate a world that commodifies their bodies while denying them true autonomy. The paradox of Babylonian prostitution, where women's bodies were essential to the economy and culture, yet their rights were consistently undermined, continues to be mirrored in modern struggles for sex workers' rights. Whether through the fight for decriminalization, the push for better working conditions, or the struggle against violence and exploitation, sex workers today are still fighting the same battles for recognition, respect, and dignity that the women of Babylon fought so long ago. The history of Babylonian prostitution is not just a lesson about the past, it is a reminder of the ways that history often repeats itself. The struggles of sex workers today are not isolated from the ancient past. They are part of a long continuum of resistance, survival, and struggle for autonomy. By reclaiming the stories of the women in Babylon's brothels and temples, we not only gain a deeper understanding of the ancient world, but we also shine a light on the ongoing fight for social justice, human rights, and gender equality. As we wrap up this journey, let's remember the resilience of the women who lived and worked in Babylon's complex and often oppressive systems. While their stories may have been silenced by history, their lives and their struggles continue to echo in the modern world. The history of Babylonian prostitution is not just a tale of exploitation, it is also one of survival, resistance, and the enduring fight for autonomy and dignity in a world that too often seeks to silence those who are most vulnerable. The final lesson we take from these women is that even in the face of immense societal pressure and systemic exploitation, they found ways to resist, survive, and sometimes even thrive. Their stories remind us that while the systems of power may be vast and overwhelming, the human spirit is capable of incredible resilience. The fight for dignity, autonomy, and justice is ongoing, and it is a fight that is as old as civilization itself.